The night had a stillness that was almost suffocating, the air thick with an unspoken tension that gripped the narrow streets of Highgate. Jack Carver, the seasoned leader of Project Nightshade, stood at the entrance of Highgate Cemetery, its Gothic gates looming like the jaws of a beast about to consume its prey. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance to a tune only the dead could hear. "Welcome to Hell's Playground," muttered Marcus, adjusting the settings of his thermal camera. His attempts at humor were half-hearted, a thin veil over palpable dread that gnawed at him. Jack shot him a sideways glance, his jaw clenched. "Keep it together, Marcus. We're here to find answers, not to lose our minds." Olivia, the team's historian and occult specialist, joined them, clutching a worn leather-bound journal. "This place, it's soaked in centuries of death. The stories, they're not just tales, Jack. There's something here." Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the mission pressing down on him. The recent string of murders had brought them here, to this ancient cemetery steeped in dark lore. Each victim had been found drained of blood, their bodies mangled in ways that defied explanation. The whispers of a vampire had begun to spread, and it was their job to find out if there was any truth to them. "Let's get moving," Jack ordered, his voice firm but betraying a hint of unease. The team moved as one, stepping through the gates and into the cold embrace of the cemetery. The headstones stood like silent sentinels, each marking a life long extinguished. But it was the mausoleums that drew the team's attention, their crumbling facades and iron doors barely containing the secrets within. As they ventured deeper into the cemetery, the temperature plummeted. Marcus frowned at his equipment. Thermal readings are all over the place. It's like the heat's being sucked right out of the air. "Or something's feeding on it," Olivia whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. The group reached a particularly old section of the cemetery, where the graves were so ancient that the names on the headstones had long since eroded. Olivia knelt by one of the graves, her fingers tracing the faint outline of an engraved symbol. "This is it. This is where they say the vampire cult performed their rituals. If Valerius is real, he's buried somewhere close." Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. A low growl echoed through the night, so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. Jack signaled for the team to halt, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. "Stay sharp," Jack hissed, his eyes scanning the darkness. Then, from the corner of his eye, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow flitting between the trees, too fast and too fluid to be human. "Did you see that?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. But before anyone could respond, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence, coming from somewhere deep within the cemetery. Without a word, the team bolted toward the sound, their flashlights cutting through the night. The scream had an unnatural quality to it, as if it was both human and something far more sinister. As they reached a clearing, they found nothing but an eerie stillness. And then they saw it, a figure draped in black, standing by a grave, its face obscured by shadows. It turned slowly, revealing eyes that glowed with an unholy light. "Run!" Jack shouted, but it was too late. The figure lunged at them with inhuman speed, and the night erupted into chaos. The darkness swallowed their screams as they fled through the cemetery, the malevolent figure hot on their heels. Jack led the charge, his mind racing to process what he had just witnessed. This wasn't some ghost or simple haunting. This was something far older, far more dangerous. "Keep moving," he barked, adrenaline surging through him. He could hear the raspy breath of the thing pursuing them, a sound that sent chills down his spine. Marcus stumbled, his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell is that thing?" he gasped, barely keeping up with the others. "Not something we want to get to know better," Olivia shouted back, her voice tinged with fear. They darted between tombstones, the path ahead winding and treacherous. The figure behind them seemed to revel in their panic, moving with an unnatural grace that defied the limits of the human body. Jack could feel it gaining on them, its presence like a cold hand reaching out to drag them into the abyss. They burst into a larger clearing, where the ancient mausoleums loomed like silent giants. Jack skidded to a halt, his eyes locking onto one of the mausoleums. A massive structure, its stone door ajar, a gaping maw inviting them in. "This way!" he shouted, leading the team inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped further, the air thick with a foul odor. They slammed the door shut behind them, plunging the interior into near-total darkness. Marcus fumbled with his flashlight, finally managing to switch it on. The beam illuminated the mausoleum's interior, stone walls lined with ancient inscriptions, and at the center, a massive sarcophagus. "This must be it," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their heavy breathing. Valerius's tomb. Jack approached the sarcophagus, every instinct screaming at him to get out while he still could. The lid was partially open, and a sickly sweet smell wafted from within. "Help me with this," he said, nodding to Marcus. Together, they pushed the lid aside, revealing the interior. But instead of a decayed corpse, they found it empty, save for a blood-stained book bound in human skin. "The Codex," Olivia breathed, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. Marcus recoiled in disgust. What kind of sick cult leaves something like this behind? Before they could contemplate further, the temperature in the room plummeted again. The walls seemed to close in on them, the darkness pressing against their very souls. "Guys," Elliot's voice was a low tremor. "We're not alone." They turned to find the shadowy figure from before standing in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on them. But now it wasn't alone. Dozens of smaller figures, crawlers, twisted and deformed, skittered along the walls and ceiling, their teeth gnashing in anticipation. "Get ready," Jack shouted, drawing his gun. But as the creatures closed in, he knew they were hopelessly outnumbered. The night had truly begun. The echoes of their breath reverberated in the crypt-like mausoleum as the crawlers closed in. Each movement was a grotesque dance of limbs and sharp teeth, filling the space with the sounds of something hungry, something waiting. Jack, his heart pounding against his ribs, didn't wait for the creatures to pounce. He fired a round into the air, the gunshot like a thunderclap in the confined space. He barked, the crack of the gun somehow less terrifying than the raspy growls surrounding him. Marcus didn't need telling twice. He bolted towards a narrow passage at the back of the mausoleum, flashlight shaking in his grip. Olivia followed close behind, clutching the cursed codex against her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Jack was the last to leave, his eyes lingering on the creatures that now hesitated, their gaze flicking to the codex. "They're afraid of it," he muttered, before taking off after his team. The passage twisted and turned, the air growing more stale and damp with each step. It was a claustrophobic nightmare, the walls slick with something that might have been water, or something far more sinister. The sound of their pursuers began to fade, the crawlers unwilling to leave the mausoleum. The trio slowed, their footsteps echoing in the silence that had settled like a shroud. "Why did they stop?" Marcus asked, panting as they rounded a corner. "It's not them you should worry about," Olivia whispered, staring ahead with wide eyes. They stepped into a larger chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were lined with alcoves, each holding a skeleton propped up as if in some macabre display. But it wasn't the bones that had Olivia's attention. It was the markings on the floor, intricate patterns carved into the stone, glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. "What the hell is this?" Jack murmured, stepping closer to examine the symbols. Olivia knelt down, tracing one of the lines with her finger. These markings, they're wards, powerful ones. Whoever set them up wasn't trying to keep something out. They were trying to keep something in. Like Valerius? Marcus asked, swallowing hard. "Maybe," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "Or something worse." Before Jack could respond, the room began to hum, a low vibration that seemed to resonate in their bones. The light from the symbols grew brighter, pulsating like a heartbeat. "We need to get out of here," Jack said, his voice tight. "Now." But as they turned to leave, a figure stepped out from the shadows. A tall, gaunt man with pale skin and eyes that gleamed like polished stone. His presence was suffocating, the air around him growing colder with each passing second. "You carry the codex," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It belongs to me. Who the hell are you?" Jack demanded, drawing his gun. The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I am the keeper of this place, the guardian of Valerius. And you have disturbed the balance." Without warning, the chamber plunged into darkness. The glow of the symbols snuffed out as if by an unseen hand. Jack fired blindly into the void, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then came the whisper, a soft, insidious voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You cannot leave. Not with the codex." Olivia screamed as something cold and unseen brushed against her arm, leaving behind a trail of frost. Marcus fumbled with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal the keeper standing impossibly close, his hand outstretched towards the codex. In that moment, Jack knew they were outmatched. But there was no turning back now. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Olivia and shoving her towards the passage. They sprinted through the darkness, the keeper's laughter echoing in their ears, a sinister melody that promised nothing but pain. They burst out of the narrow passage and into the open night air, gasping for breath. The cemetery lay before them, quiet and indifferent to the horrors they had just witnessed. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the gravestones. "We have to get back to the van," Jack said, scanning the area. "We need to regroup and figure out what the hell that thing was." "The codex," Olivia whispered, clutching the book tightly. "It's more powerful than we realized. We can't just leave it here." Marcus nodded, but his eyes were wide with fear. "That guy back there, he's not human. We're dealing with something way out of our league, Jack." "I know," Jack admitted, his voice grim, "but we have no choice. If we leave the codex here, who knows what will happen." They moved quickly, weaving between the tombstones and keeping to the shadows. The cemetery seemed even more sinister now, as if it were watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. As they neared the exit, they heard the sound of chanting. Low and rhythmic, it seemed to come from all around them, the words unintelligible but laced with malice. "Not good," Marcus muttered, his hand hovering over his gun. They reached the cemetery gates and stopped dead in their tracks. A group of figures stood in the middle of the road, cloaked in black robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They formed a circle, and in the center, a woman was bound to a stone altar, her eyes wide with terror. "It's a ritual," Olivia whispered, horror dawning on her face. "They're going to sacrifice her." Jack's mind raced. They couldn't just walk into this. They were outnumbered, and whatever power the cultists wielded was likely tied to the codex. But they couldn't leave the woman to die, either. "We have to stop them," Jack said, his voice firm. "Marcus, you flank left. Olivia, stay behind me." They moved as one, creeping towards the ritual site. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, as the cultists raised their arms to the sky. Jack could see the woman struggling against her bonds, her muffled screams barely audible over the chanting. "On my mark," Jack whispered, his grip tightening on his gun. 3, 2. Before he could finish, the chanting stopped abruptly, and the cultists turned to face them. Their eyes glowed an unnatural red, and Jack felt a wave of malevolence wash over him. "Oh crap," Marcus muttered, raising his gun. The cultists moved in unison, their hands outstretched as they began to chant once more. The ground beneath the trio began to shake, and Jack realized too late that they had walked right into a trap. "Get down!" he shouted, but it was no use. The earth split open beneath them, and they were swallowed by darkness, the sound of the woman's terrified screams echoing in their ears as they fell. Ack hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. The breath knocked out of him as he tumbled into the darkness. Dust filled his lungs as he coughed and scrambled to his feet, his hands finding the cold, rough surface of stone. His flashlight, now miraculously still in his hand, flickered weakly, casting a dim glow over the cavernous space they had fallen into. Marcus? Olivia? His voice echoed eerily in the vast chamber. Here, Olivia's shaky voice answered from somewhere to his left. The beam of her flashlight swung across the walls, revealing ancient carvings that seemed to writhe in the dim light. Marcus groaned from a few feet away, rubbing his head. What the hell just happened? Jack helped him to his feet. We fell into a trap, he muttered, trying to make sense of their surroundings. The walls were lined with strange symbols, pulsating with a faint, malevolent energy. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the scent of blood. This place, Olivia whispered, her voice tinged with awe. It's some kind of ritual chamber. Jack's flashlight caught the edge of an altar at the far end of the chamber, and he felt his stomach drop. The stone slab was slick with dark stains, fresh and ominous. Chains hung from the ceiling, swinging gently as if disturbed by a recent struggle. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized this wasn't just any ritual chamber. It was a place of sacrifice. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said, his voice cracking with panic. "This is bad, Jack. Really bad." Olivia was already moving towards the altar, the codex held tightly in her hands. "Wait," she said, her eyes wide as she examined the carvings on the altar. "These symbols, they're not just for binding. They're for summoning." Jack felt a cold knot form in his gut. Summoning what? Olivia's face paled as she traced the lines with trembling fingers. A demon, a very powerful one. They must have been using the codex to amplify their ritual. A low rumble echoed through the chamber, and Jack spun around, his flashlight sweeping across the darkness. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the walls seemed to close in, the carvings twisting and contorting as if coming to life. "We need to go now," Jack barked, grabbing Olivia by the arm and pulling her away from the altar. But as they turned to flee, the air around them grew colder, and a deep guttural growl filled the chamber. Shadows coalesced in the center of the room, forming a towering figure with glowing red eyes and claws that gleamed like obsidian. "Too late," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. The demon took a step forward, its presence suffocating. Jack raised his gun, but his hands were shaking so badly that he could barely keep it steady. "Back off!" he shouted, firing a shot that echoed through the chamber. The bullet struck the demon's chest, but it barely flinched. Instead, it let out a roar that rattled the very stones around them, and the ground beneath their feet gave way once more. This time, they fell through the darkness in a whirlwind of stone and debris, the chamber collapsing around them. Jack clung to Olivia and Marcus as they plummeted deeper into the earth, the demon's enraged howl following them into the abyss. They landed in a sprawling underground catacomb, a twisted maze of tunnels and tombs that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The floor was littered with bones, and the walls were adorned with decaying remnants of ancient rituals. The air was thick with dust and the unmistakable scent of death. Jack was the first to rise, shaking off the debris and casting his flashlight around. The tunnels were narrow and winding, the walls so close they had to walk single file. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, the darkness itself seeming to press in on them, like a living entity waiting to consume them. Olivia groaned as she stood, clutching the codex to her chest like a lifeline. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Marcus was silent, his face twisted in a grimace as he clutched his side, wincing with every breath. "Are you okay?" Jack asked, but Marcus waved him off. "I'll live," he muttered. "What the hell is this place?" It's like an extension of the chamber above," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "A labyrinth designed to trap and disorient anyone who enters." "Great," Jack said dryly, trying to keep the terror from his voice. As if things weren't bad enough, they started down one of the tunnels, their flashlights casting long shadows that danced eerily on the walls. The further they went, the more the air seemed to grow heavy, as if the very atmosphere was thickening around them. Every step echoed in the dark, and Jack had to fight the urge to look over his shoulder, convinced that something was following them, just out of sight. Suddenly, they heard a faint, distant sound, a low, mournful wail that sent chills down their spines. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, growing louder with each passing moment. "Do you hear that?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Olivia nodded, her face pale. "It's the spirits trapped here. They're warning us." "Warning us about what?" Jack asked, his voice tight with anxiety. The answer came in the form of a skittering noise, like the sound of nails scraping against stone. It was followed by a series of guttural growls, growing louder and more numerous. The tunnel around them seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what was coming. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Olivia and pulling her forward just as the shadows around them seemed to come alive. Crawlers, dozens of them, emerged from the walls and ceiling, their pale, emaciated bodies moving with unnatural speed. Their eyes gleamed with hunger, their mouths opening to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. The team sprinted down the tunnel, the crawlers hot on their heels. Jack fired blindly behind him, the gunshots echoing in the confined space. But the creatures were relentless, their inhuman screeches filling the tunnel as they closed in. Up ahead, the tunnel began to widen into another chamber, this one filled with flickering torchlight. Jack pushed Olivia forward, urging her to keep running even as the crawlers snapped at their heels. They burst into the chamber, only to find themselves surrounded by even more crawlers, their eyes glowing in the dim light. Jack's heart sank as he realized they were trapped, creatures closing in from all sides. The only way out was through the mass of writhing bodies, their teeth gnashing and claws reaching for them. But Jack wasn't ready to give up. "Not yet. Get ready," he said, raising his gun once more as the first of the crawlers lunged. Jack's pulse raced as the darkness closed in around them, the flickering torchlight casting wild, distorted shadows on the walls of the chamber. The crawlers hissed, their glowing eyes locked onto the three survivors. But before they could attack, the chamber trembled, and the ground beneath them shifted. "Move!" Jack shouted, grabbing Olivia and Marcus, and pulling them toward a narrow passage that had appeared at the far end of the chamber. It wasn't an escape, they knew that much, but it was better than standing still. They dashed into the passage, barely dodging the grasping claws of the crawlers. The tunnel was tight and claustrophobic, the walls slick with some kind of viscous liquid that made every step treacherous. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as they ran, the sounds of the crawlers' pursuit echoing behind them. The passage opened suddenly into a vast hall lined with towering mirrors. The air here was colder, thick with an unsettling energy that made the hairs on Jack's neck stand on end. The mirrors were ancient, their surfaces cracked and fogged, reflecting warped images of the team as they staggered into the room. "Is this another trap?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Everything's a trap here," Jack muttered, scanning the room. "But we don't have a choice. Keep moving." Olivia stared at the mirrors, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and terror. "These aren't just mirrors," she whispered. "They're doorways. Doorways to where?" Jack asked, but Olivia didn't answer. Instead, she stepped toward one of the mirrors, her hand outstretched as if drawn by some invisible force. "Olivia, no." Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her back just as her fingertips brushed the glass. The mirror rippled, like the surface of a disturbed pond, and for a moment, the image in the glass changed, showing not Olivia, but a dark, twisted version of her, with hollow eyes and a malicious grin. The reflection reached out, its fingers pressing against the inside of the glass, as if trying to break through. "Let's get out of here," Jack ordered, his voice barely masking the rising panic. But the room had other plans. The mirrors around them began to ripple and shift, the reflections inside them moving of their own. From each mirror, twisted versions of themselves emerged, pale, shadowy figures with cold, dead eyes and wicked smiles. Jack fired his gun at the nearest doppelganger, but the bullet passed through it as if it were smoke, shattering the mirror behind it. The glass exploded outward, sending shards flying. The figure dissipated, but its malevolent energy hung in the air like a thick fog. "We can't fight them," Olivia shouted, trying to keep her voice steady. "They're us, our worst fears, our darkest thoughts." "Then how do we stop them?" Marcus asked, backing away as his own doppelganger advanced, its eyes glittering with predatory hunger. "We don't," Olivia said, her voice filled with an eerie calm. "We have to confront them." Before Jack could protest, Olivia stepped forward, facing her doppelganger head-on. The two locked eyes, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then the shadowy figure lunged, its hands closing around Olivia's throat. But instead of fighting back, Olivia stood her ground, staring into its hollow eyes. The doppelganger's grip tightened, but as it did, its form began to waver, growing more insubstantial by the second. With a final, gasping breath, it evaporated, leaving Olivia standing alone, gasping for air. "We have to face them," she rasped, "or they'll consume us." Jack and Marcus exchanged a glance, then nodded, steeling themselves for the fight. One by one, they turned to face their twisted reflections, each confrontation more harrowing than the last. Jack's own doppelganger sneered at him, its eyes gleaming with cruelty. It whispered his darkest secrets, his deepest regrets, but Jack forced himself to stand tall, to face the reflection without fear. "You're not real," he said through gritted teeth. "You're just a shadow." The figure lunged, but Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he reached out, his hand passing through the figure's chest as if it were smoke. The shadow screamed, a sound that echoed through the chamber, before dissolving into nothingness. One by one, the mirrors shattered, fragments falling to the ground like drops of rain. The air grew still, the oppressive energy dissipating as the last doppelganger vanished. Jack collapsed to his knees, exhaustion washing over him. Olivia and Marcus were similarly drained, their faces pale and drawn. "We did it," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "Not yet," Jack said, pushing himself to his feet. "We still have to get out of here." But as they turned to leave the shattered hall, the ground trembled once more, and a low, menacing growl echoed through the chamber. Jack's heart sank as he realized their ordeal was far from over. The tremor subsided, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The three of them stood motionless, listening intently. The growl seemed to resonate from the depths of the earth, vibrating through the walls and floor. "We need to move. Now," Jack urged, his voice tight with anxiety. Without waiting for a response, he started down the only passage leading out of the Hall of Mirrors, the dim light of his flashlight bobbing erratically as they hurried along. The passage twisted and turned, narrowing in some places until they had to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for their bodies. The air grew thick and stifling, the stench of decay becoming more overpowering with every step. "What is that smell?" Marcus gagged, covering his nose and mouth with the sleeve of his jacket. "Whatever it is, it's close," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. She clutched the codex tightly, as if its ancient knowledge could protect her from what lay ahead. The tunnel abruptly opened into a cavernous chamber, and the source of the stench became horrifyingly clear. The walls were lined with the decaying remains of past victims, some human, others unidentifiable, their bodies twisted and contorted in death. The ground was littered with bones, some fresh, some ancient, all picked clean by whatever horrors resided here. In the center of the chamber, a massive figure hunched over a grotesque altar. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Long, bony arms ended in claws that gleamed like obsidian, and its eyes, sunken and hollow, glowed with a faint, malevolent light. "The beast!" Olivia breathed, terror freezing her in place. The creature's head snapped up, its eyes locking onto them. It let out a low, rumbling growl, reverberating through the chamber, a sound filled with ancient malice and hunger. "Run!" Jack shouted, grabbing Olivia and pulling her back toward the tunnel. But the beast was faster than any of them could have anticipated. With a speed that belied its size, the creature lunged, its claws raking through the air where Jack had been standing a moment before. The force of the attack sent him sprawling, his flashlight skidding across the floor and plunging the chamber into near darkness. Marcus drew his gun and fired. A muzzle flash briefly illuminated the chamber. The bullets struck the beast's hide, but they might as well have been pebbles against a mountain. The creature roared, its voice shaking the very walls, and charged toward Marcus. Jack scrambled to his feet, grabbing Olivia as they ducked behind a crumbling pillar. "We need to distract it," he hissed, glancing around the chamber for anything they could use to their advantage. But there was nothing, just the cold, unyielding stone, the scattered remains of past victims, and the monstrous presence of the beast. Marcus fired again, backing toward the tunnel. "Any bright ideas?" he shouted over the deafening roar of the creature. Olivia's eyes darted around the chamber, landing on the altar. "The codex!" she shouted. "It can bind the creature. We need to use it." Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed the codex from Olivia and flipped through its pages, his hands shaking as he searched for the binding ritual. The words were ancient, their meanings lost to time, but he could feel the power thrumming beneath the surface. The beast turned toward them, its eyes burning with fury. It knew what they were trying to do, and it wasn't about to let them succeed. "Keep it busy," Jack yelled to Marcus, who nodded grimly and opened fire again, this time aiming for the creature's eyes. Olivia joined Jack, her voice trembling as she began to recite the incantation. The air around them crackled with energy, the words of the ritual resonating in the chamber, pulling at the very fabric of reality. The beast howled, its form flickering as if it were being torn apart from the inside. It charged toward them, claws outstretched, but the power of the codex was already taking hold. With a final, earth-shaking roar, the beast was pulled back toward the altar, its body dissolving into a swirling vortex of darkness. The chamber shook violently, and the tunnel walls began to collapse. "Run!" Jack shouted, grabbing Olivia and Marcus as they sprinted. The sun was beginning to set as Jack, Olivia, and Marcus stood outside the rusty gate of Highgate Cemetery. The once majestic resting place had fallen into disrepair, its gravestones crumbling and overgrown with ivy, the towering mausoleums casting long, eerie shadows. They had followed the trail here to the final resting place of the vampire of Highgate, the creature they had been hunting. "There's no turning back now," Olivia said, her voice tinged with both fear and determination. She tightened her grip on the wooden stake. The cold metal of the silver dagger strapped to her belt's comforting weight. "Right," Marcus agreed, his usually sarcastic tone subdued. He checked the ammo in his revolver. Though they all knew bullets wouldn't do much against what they were about to face. His gun was loaded with silver bullets, just in case, but even those wouldn't be enough if they weren't precise. Jack pushed open the gate, its rusty hinges creaking ominously. "We end this tonight. Whatever that thing is, it dies again." They moved cautiously through the cemetery, the oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of dead leaves beneath their boots. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that danced at the edges of their vision. "Where do you think it's hiding?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of their own hearts. Olivia scanned the rows of tombs, her eyes narrowing on a mausoleum at the far end of the cemetery. It was larger than the others, its stone walls cracked and weathered with age, the iron door ajar. "There," she said, pointing. "That's where it's been hiding. That's where it took them." Jack nodded, leading the way toward the mausoleum. As they approached, the temperature dropped noticeably, their breath forming small clouds in the air. The sense of foreboding was almost tangible, a dark energy radiating from within. The three of them stood before the entrance, exchanging a silent nod before Jack pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, and the heavy door swung inward, revealing a steep staircase leading down into the darkness. "Ready?" Jack asked, though he knew the answer. They had come too far to turn back now. They descended into the darkness, the narrow staircase winding deep beneath the cemetery. The air grew colder, the smell of damp earth mixing with something far more sinister. The sound of dripping water echoed through the passage, accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a vast underground chamber, the walls lined with rows of ancient coffins. In the center of the room stood a massive stone sarcophagus, its lid slightly ajar. The chamber was filled with an eerie, pale light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "He's here," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. As if in response, the lid of the sarcophagus slowly slid open, revealing the figure inside. The vampire of Highgate was even more terrifying than they had imagined, tall and gaunt, with pale, almost translucent skin stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its eyes were a deep blood red, glowing with an unnatural hunger, and its fangs gleamed in the dim light. "You dare to disturb my rest?" the vampire hissed, its voice low and menacing, reverberating through the chamber. Jack didn't hesitate. "You've taken too many lives," he said, his voice steady. "It ends here." The vampire moved with unnatural speed, lunging at them with outstretched claws. Olivia raised her stake, but the creature was too fast, its hands slashing across her arm and sending her sprawling to the ground. Marcus fired his revolver, the silver bullets hitting their mark, but the vampire barely flinched, its focus now on Jack. The creature's eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, Jack felt the cold grip of fear tightening around his heart. But he shook it off, dodging the vampire's attack and plunging his own stake into its chest. The vampire howled, its body convulsing as the stake pierced its heart. But instead of crumbling to dust, the creature grabbed Jack by the throat, lifting him off the ground with human strength. "You think this will stop me?" the vampire sneered, its voice dripping with malice. But Olivia wasn't done yet. She struggled to her feet, clutching the silver dagger in her hand. With a fierce cry, she drove the blade into the vampire's back, the silver burning through its flesh like acid. The vampire screamed, releasing Jack and staggering backward. Marcus fired again, aiming for the creature's head, and this time the bullet struck true, tearing through its skull with a sickening crack. The vampire fell to its knees, its body disintegrating into ash before their eyes. The chamber was filled with a blinding light as the creature let out one final, anguished scream before vanishing into nothingness. Silence fell over the chamber, the oppressive darkness lifting as the last remnants of the vampire were destroyed. Jack, Olivia, and Marcus stood panting, their bodies bruised and bloody but victorious. "It's over," Olivia said, her voice barely a whisper. Jack nodded, wiping the sweat and blood from his brow. "Yeah, it's finally over." They left the mausoleum in silence, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees as they stepped back into the cemetery. The world seemed brighter, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. But they knew better than to let their guard down. Evil never truly died. It only slept, waiting for the right moment to return. A month had passed since the battle in Highgate Cemetery, and life had slowly returned to normal for Jack, Olivia, and Marcus. Or at least, as normal as life could be for those who had faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale. They had returned to their respective lives, trying to forget the horrors they had witnessed. But the memories lingered, like shadows in the corners of their minds, refusing to fade. Jack found himself waking in the middle of the night, his heart racing, the sound of the vampire's final scream still echoing in his ears. Olivia had taken to carrying a silver dagger with her at all times, the weight of it a constant reminder of the battle they had fought. Marcus had thrown himself into his work, trying to drown out the memories from the mundane routines of everyday life. But they couldn't escape the past. The shadows that had haunted them in Highgate Cemetery were not so easily banished. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the city. Jack received a call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it carried a weight of urgency that made his blood run cold. "It's happening again," the voice said, trembling with fear. "The disappearances, the bodies, it's all starting again." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "Where?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Highgate," the voice replied. "It's back." Jack hung up the phone, a sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew what he had to do. He gathered his gear, the wooden stake, the silver dagger, the revolver loaded with silver bullets, and set out for Highgate Cemetery. He didn't bother calling Olivia or Marcus. They would know soon enough. The bond they shared was strong, forged in the crucible of battle, and they would come when they were needed. The cemetery was silent as Jack approached, the gate swinging open with an eerie creak. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light over the gravestones. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. As Jack stepped through the gate, he felt a presence behind him. He turned, half expecting to see the vampire standing there, its blood-red eyes glowing in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the shadows shifting and moving as if they were alive. But Jack knew better. The darkness was never empty. He made his way through the cemetery, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The mausoleum loomed ahead, its door still ajar, as if waiting for him. He hesitated for a moment, the memories of that night flooding back, but he pushed them aside, steeling himself for what was to come. The shadows seemed to close in around him as he entered the mausoleum, the air growing colder with each step. The staircase leading down into the chamber was as dark and foreboding as ever, but Jack didn't falter. He descended into the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest, his hand tightening around the stake. The chamber was just as he remembered it, the stone sarcophagus still in the center, the walls lined with ancient coffins. But something was different. The air was charged with a familiar, sinister energy, and the oppressive darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides. As he stepped into the chamber, he saw it, the faint outline of a figure standing in the shadows, its eyes glowing with a dull, malevolent light. "Back so soon?" the voice hissed, dripping with malice. Jack didn't respond. He knew there was no reasoning with the darkness, no bargaining with the evil that lurked in the shadows. The figure stepped forward, its form solidifying into something all too familiar. The vampire of Highgate, reborn from the ashes of.